All right, this is part 2 of Galileo. He found the moons of Jupiter, these moons going around in their object. What he would do is he would watch it and he would see these dots. And then the next night he would look and he would see these dots and they've changed position. And he would realize after watching them over many, many nights that they were all going around Jupiter. And we have his journals that show these pictures, these sketches that he made. Second, he found that there were phases of Venus. All right, this right here, phases of Venus, all phases of Venus, I should say, just to be clear. All phases. Proved that Ptolemy was wrong. That one observation. And you're like, how? All right, I will explain it to you. Remember, in Ptolemy's model, the Earth was at the center. Then we had the sun out here. Here's the sun, going around the Earth. And then there was a line between them, and Venus was on an epicycle with its center connected to the sun. All right. So, what happens is, remember the sun lights up Venus, and so the side that's lit up at this side, so when we look at it from Earth, we're only going to see a crescent. And it doesn't matter, even when Venus is over here, we're still going to see a crescent phase. Over here, we're only going to see a small crescent phase. Over here, we're still going to see it because the side facing the sun is always away from us. All we're seeing is the little edge of that. But the reality is because Venus actually goes around the sun, so here's the Earth, here's the sun, here's Venus going around. When Venus is back here, we see the lit up side. This would be a gibbous Venus. And then when it's at greatest elongation, you would have a half-lit Venus, and then in here you'd have a crescent Venus, and you would see all phases of Venus. But you can only see all phases of Venus if Venus is going around the sun. So Venus has to be going around the sun. It's not going around in some circle in between the Earth and the sun. Number 3. He saw craters and mountains on the moon. Now with your naked eye, you can see that there's dark and light regions. But that's about all you can tell. You couldn't actually see any craters or mountains. But as soon as you have a telescope, it doesn't take hardly any power at all. You don't have a pair of binoculars. You can see craters on the moon. Why was this important? Well, this was important because remember the heavens were supposed to be perfect and the moon was part of the heavens. So it was supposed to be a perfect sphere. It wasn't supposed to have craters and mountains and stuff on it. It was supposed to be perfectly smooth. And so seeing the craters and mountains on the moon just went to show that, oh, this idea of the heavens being different than the Earth was not true. Number 4. He saw sunspots. On the sun. And yeah, so what he did to look at the sun is he would again hold a filter, a thick dark glass, in front of his telescope, look at the sun, and he saw these sunspots. And he would see that they moved, and that the sun was rotating around. I mean, it's one thing to have craters on the moon, but the sun that brings us light and everything is supposed to be perfect. To see these blemishes on the sun meant that it was not perfect at all. Now, at one time people claimed that it was looking at the sun, which is why he went blind later in his life, because he did go blind. We think now from forensics evidence that's probably not true. He probably had cataracts, which many people get nowadays, but now you can go in and get surgery in an afternoon and have it fixed. They replace it with a different lens. But back then there was no fixing your cataracts. And the last thing he saw was that the Milky Way was composed of thousands of stars. So what he realized when he looked outside and you see the Milky Way, it looks like a kind of a glowing cloud through part of the sky. And he realized what happens is there's actually just thousands and thousands of stars there that are too faint to be seen with your naked eye, but the light from all of them glows together, which gives that cloud appearance. But as soon as you have a telescope, you see thousands of stars, and if you get a bigger telescope, it breaks up into millions of stars, just millions and millions of stars. Everywhere you look towards the Milky Way, there's stars. So that one really didn't confirm or deny anything, but these were his main findings. And we found that from his book, from his journals, he wrote about these findings, and he wrote about what this meant. What it really meant, and what he believed was that this proved, the things he found proved that Copernicus was correct. That the heliocentric theory was correct, and that by the time he was getting old, Kepler had come up with the 3 laws of motion, and it pretty much was all falling into place, that they were starting to actually understand our place in the solar system. All right, so let's see what Galileo looks like. This is a portrait of Galileo when he was old. Now notice, Galileo actually lived a long time here, right? He lived to be like 78 years old, which was very old for that time. So he lived pretty well, long life expectancy. That's Kepler. Here's Galileo right here. Let me adjust our lighting so we can see it a little better. So this is Galileo when he got older, and that was when he got in trouble with the church. Everyone wants to know the story of Galileo getting in trouble with the church. Well, it's a very interesting story because he actually had a friend, a guy that he knew, that grew up in northern Italy, and he knew him because he was Catholic, everybody was Catholic at the time, and he was actually very religious. He wasn't against the Catholic Church. But he was a scientist. He believed these things were right, and he didn't understand why the Catholic Church wouldn't accept it. But he wasn't going to publish his works because the Pope was very against it, the original Pope. Now that Pope died, and his friend that he knew from back when he was growing up actually became the Pope. And he thought, oh, this is my chance, I can publish it. Now he probably would have got away with publishing his work if he had done it in a kind of more scientific, this is what I found, this is what I think it means. Instead, he wrote it as a dialogue book, meaning he wrote it with 3 people just talking about things. One was supposed to represent Galileo, one was supposed to represent the church and their views, and one was supposed to be kind of a neutral person in between. And he would write it so that Galileo would bring up, hey, this is what I saw, this is what this means, and then he would put the Catholic Church saying, no, that's not what it means this. And he kind of went out of his way to make the church look really bad, and it was just not a flattering view, and if he didn't write it that way, he might have got away with writing it. But because he did it that way, the Catholic Church found it was an affront to them, and they put Galileo on trial. And he was tried before the Roman Inquisition on the charge of believing and holding doctrines that are false and contrary to divine scriptures. After several days of the trial went on for several days, and even back then they kept a record of the whole trial, and that record still exists. About the 3rd day of the trial, Galileo was not recanting, he was not giving it, and they took him down to the basement, the Roman Inquisition, because back then they could still get a confession out of you by using their torture equipment. Now they never tortured Galileo, but they showed it to him. Galileo was already getting old at this time, he was getting close to 70 years old. It was near the end of his life, okay? He was in his 60s. And his body was kind of racked, and he's like, I can't go on the rack and get stretched out, I can't survive this. And so at the last day, I think it was the 4th day of his trial, he came back up and he essentially said, okay, what do you want me to do? And so he had to write essentially a paper saying, no, none of this was true, that the church is actually right, this was just a mistake that I put this out there. And so, he did. He recanted essentially at that time. They found him guilty, and they sentenced him to house arrest for the remaining 10 years of life, and that he couldn't publish anymore. Now, he did end up publishing more, but he published what posthumously. After he died, he had books ready, and then these other people published it. So he became very famous throughout the European world at that time. And it was Galileo that actually helped to inspire Newton, who we'll talk about next. Also during that time, when he was in that house confinement, he was conversing, he could write letters. That's when he was conversing with Kepler through letters. And he was going blind at the time, and he was under arrest, so they actually had to have a guard there so he couldn't leave, but they would have to bring him food and stuff. So it was kind of a weird situation near the end of his life. So that's what happened. Now, to give the Catholic Church credit, it took 400 years later, but I think in 1990, 90-something, I don't know the exact year, the Catholic Church actually reopened Galileo's case, re-looked at all the data, and found that Galileo was not guilty of holding these beliefs that were not true, and that he should be recanted, and they did that 400 some years later, and that the church was wrong. You might say, oh, why would they do it 400 years later? Well, I was kind of impressed with the Catholic Church because at least they were willing to admit it. Most churches or organizations, almost every organization, has some kind of skeletons in their closet, some problem in their past. It's just most of them hide that forever. But the Catholic Church was willing to admit we made a mistake. All right, here's a couple things about Galileo. This is Galileo's telescope, and I have a replica of what one of his telescopes like, his second one, which is the bigger, better telescope. This is a replica of it, so you can see this is the actual size of it. So this was the size of the telescope here. This would have been the longer one right here, matching up with that. This is one of the lenses from the telescope that they did in here. This is in Galileo's museum, which is in Florence. And I've been there, it's very neat. They have lots of cool stuff. These are journals from his book. This shows the moons of Jupiter orbiting around Jupiter from night to night. This shows sunspots on the sun. These are his notes as he wrote about what he saw.